All right, welcome back. I'm Ezra Levant. You're watching The Source. What a powerful interview. I now know why he has to travel with security. He says controversial things, and, I have to say some of them are a little bit far from me. But that's not the point. The point is he wants to talk about these things. He wants to talk about the separation of mosque and state, about the role of women and gay rights and radical Islam. And joining us to help put that in perspective is Brooke Goldstein, a filmmaker, a lawyer by profession, and the director of the Lawfare project. Brooke, thanks for joining us from New York.
Ezra, thank you so much for having me.
Brooke, look, I agree with most of what Geert Wilders says, not 100%, but let's say 80 or 90%. What bothers me just as much as the substance, though, is the way that people are trying to censor him through lawfare. Do you want to talk to, you're the head of the Lawfare project, do you want to talk to us a bit about this new phenomenon of silencing people through lawsuits?
Absolutely. I 100% agree with you. Whether or not one agrees with the content of what Wilders has to say, he has a right to say it. We, as a free society, have a right to debate his ideas, and you, Ezra, have a right to have me on your show to discuss them. Could you imagine the implications of a democratically elected official speaking to his constituents about issues of national security, getting thrown into jail for that? The chilling effect that that's going to have on other politicians throughout Europe, throughout Canada, is absolutely detrimental. And Wilders' case cannot be seen in a vacuum. It is indeed what you said, a symptom of a much larger phenomenon, that of lawfare, the use of the law as a weapon of war to, amongst other things, silence and punish free speech about radical Islam, terrorism, its sources of financing.
Well, I saw Wilders show up at our studios today. There must have been 10 security guards, and they're to stop the ruffians from physically hurting him, but they're no good against lawsuits. I mean, literally right now he's being prosecuted. Is that really all it is? Is it it's easier for a radical Muslim group to silence Geert Wilders with a lawsuit or with censorship than with a bomb?
Well, look, the lawsuits are a one-two punch. They complement the violence, and the aim is to intimidate these people into silence. You see people like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who are now in hiding. You see people like Irshad Manji, both Muslim women who are talking about issues of human rights in the Islamic context, who also have to travel around with security guards. But let's also mention a couple of the other examples of the lawsuits, okay? I don't know if you heard about today, but Angela Merkel, who's the head of the German government, is now being charged with the crime of endorsing a crime because she was glad that Osama bin Laden was killed. You have lawsuits against NYPD officials like counterterrorism official Bruce Teft. A Muslim John Doe police officer filed a lawsuit against him for workplace harassment because he was personally offended by the counterterrorism briefings that Bruce Teft was giving to the NYPD after 9/11. You have the example of Hassan Diol Islam, an Iranian American who fled Iran because he was being persecuted, who thought he would be able to write and speak freely about the connections that NIAC, the National Iranian American Council, has to the Iranian regime. He is also now being slapped with a defamation lawsuit. And the interesting thing to see is whether or not these lawsuits are going to survive the discovery process. Because in the United States, we have a concept, you're innocent till proven guilty, for example, in a criminal trial. So if somebody accuses me of libeling them or slandering them, I have the right to prove the truth of my statement. So during the discovery process, all those people who are accused of slandering the Council on American Islamic Relations, or NIAC, are now going to have access to their financials, and they can prove basically the truth of what they're saying. So it'll be interesting to see if the cases are dropped before discovery.
Well, let me tell you, as someone who's gone through a 900-day prosecution at the hands of the Alberta Human Rights Commission when I published the Danish cartoons, there's also the cost and the hassle. I mean, besides the huge legal fees, there's the waste of time. I think that's an important element in lawfare. Even if these nuisance suits don't win, even if Geert Wilders is acquitted, and I hope he will be, it's still wasting his time, wasting his money, when he could be doing other things. And you slap enough suits on a guy, it's like Gulliver and Lilliput.
So, right, and then you have sort of self-imposed censorship. You have, for example, the creators of South Park wanted to do a parody on Muhammad, and they were censored by Comedy Central without even the threat of a lawsuit. Perhaps it was reported there were threats of potential violence. You have Yale Press, for example, that refused to publish the now infamous cartoons of Muhammad with a bomb in his turban because they were also afraid of the legal and physical implications of that. So far, it's a very effective strategy, but I just want to broaden the picture a little bit. Lawfare is more than just about using the law to silence and punish free speech about radical Islam. There are two other goals. Number one being to frustrate and hinder our ability to defend ourselves against terrorism, and the second being to delegitimize the sovereignty of certain democratic states, and the number one target of that is Israel. We have, for example, the Goldstone Report, a highly politicized and legally flawed document that attempts to establish a precedent in international law that a democratic country cannot fight and defeat and win the war against terrorists who are hiding behind civilians, who are using children as human bombs. You had, for example, the ICJ decision, the International Court of Justice, that declared Israel's security fence, brick and mortar, a crime against humanity, while pointedly ignoring the fact that the fence contributed to a very sharp decline in the loss of human lives,
Brooke,
and while refusing to accept any testimony from Israeli victims.
I think the biggest impact of this lawfare, of these threats of human rights commissions and hate crime prosecutions and UN investigations, is that people simply stay quiet. A newspaper editor says, yeah, I'm not going to risk complaining about burqas because I don't need to be slapped with a hassle suit and spend $100,000 defending myself. I think the number one problem is people censoring themselves. Brooke, unfortunately, time goes too quickly. Thank you so much for joining us on the phone from New York City. Brooke Goldstein, the director of the Lawfare Project. I'm sure we'll talk to her a lot more because, unfortunately, this syndrome, this attack on freedom of speech, isn't going away soon. I'm Ezra Levant. We've got more after the break. My final thoughts on today's interesting discussions. Coming right back. What do you think of that? Geert Wilders, a very controversial person. That's why there's so many fatwas calling for his death. I agree with most of what he says. I think we've got to strengthen our belief in our own culture. I don't think all cultures are equal. A culture that would put a woman in a burqa, to me, is not as enlightened as a culture that treats men and women equally. I think a culture that doesn't believe in the non-violent solution of problems is not as enlightened as ours. I believe in the separation of mosque and state. So I think I go about 80 or 90% of the way that Geert Wilders does, but I can't go with him to say that we should shut down Islamic schools or mosques. I think that we should be very skeptical and critical and perhaps shut down those that preach true radicalism, terrorism even, but I just can't go with them that last mile. But you know what? That's the point. Is that we're having a discussion, we're figuring out what's right for Canada. Maybe what he's saying is right for Holland. I'm not sure. I don't know enough of what's going on there. But we're not even allowed to talk about these things if the human rights commissions and the prosecutors and all the censors and busybodies have their way. I think it's so ironic that he's protected with a bodyguard of men with guns, but it might be a lawyer that undoes him. Now, I don't think that we should turn political disagreements into crimes. Unless we're advocating violence, I think speech should be uninhibited. And he, in fact, didn't call for violence at all. He's the opposite. He's against violence. I think it's ironic that he was put on the terrorist list, the no-fly list for the UK, and true terrorists weren't. Very interesting. I want to hear your views, too. Hey, send me a note to thesource@sunmedia.ca or tweet me on twitter.com/Ezra Levant. I'm sure we'll be talking about this interview for days to come. There's a lot more coming up on the Sun News Network tonight. Right after me is the Daily Brief with David Aiken, the Caldwell Account with Theo Caldwell, Charles Adler, and Brian Lilly on Byline. But remember us in the morning, too. Hey, Sun News is on the air at 4 a.m. in Calgary, 6 a.m. in Windsor. I'm Ezra.